The U.S. military spent 32 years trying to replace the Beretta M9. It took 5 official programs and over $600 million in procurement costs to finally land on the Sig Sauer M17 and 18. But it also came with a bunch of controversy. But do you still remember all the designs submitted during this time and why none of them were selected? So it all started with the XM10 trials in 1987, after a few M9 slides started cracking during training. So the Army got orders to run another competition, even though they just picked the M9 2 years earlier. So let's start with Ruger. So Ruger showcased their P85 design. It was a high-capacity 9mm duty pistol with polymer grip panels. The frame is aluminum, and it came with an ambidextrous safety. So Ruger was betting on their reputation for building reliable, affordable firearms to carry them through. But it failed the second round of testing, and Ruger was out. Next up, Smith & Wesson came up with the Model 459M, which was already being used by law enforcement, including the FBI. So Smith & Wesson built this trial pistol with some serious modifications. It had an extended 20-round magazine designed specifically for the competition, an aluminum alloy frame with most steel parts Parkerized, and a squared-off checkered trigger guard. But this version didn't have a magazine safety. But here's the thing, was that in the final round of testing, the Army ran the Smith & Wesson 459M and the Ruger P85 against the Beretta M9 as a control. Neither competitor outperformed the M9, so the Army just said forget it and decided to stick with the Beretta and buy more of them. But more on that dispute later. Then Tanfoglio showed up with the TZ99 design, which was basically an Italian clone of the CZ75. But Tanfoglio didn't have the manufacturing capacity or the political connections to compete seriously. So no one took it seriously, and then it was eliminated from the competition just like that. The next one was from Browning. So Browning submitted the BDA, and this is a double-action pistol originally designed by Sig Sauer in Switzerland, then licensed to Browning. But this was kind of ironic because considering Sig Sauer would eventually win the replacement contract 30 years later. But in 1987, the BDA was also eliminated. Remember we said that Beretta kept the contract. So what happened was that the 92F performed the best during testing, probably because they'd already spent 2 years fixing the exact problems the military complained about. And so the Army ordered another roughly 57,000 pistols in 1989, and that cost the taxpayers another almost $10 million, which works out to about $175 per unit. But the weird part came when Sig Sauer boycotted the entire competition. Their argument was that they'd competed in the original XM9 trials in 1984 with their P226, but they were in second place. And then watch the Army give the contract to Beretta anyway for cost reasons. And it wasn't judged fairly based on engineering. So when the Army said, hey, if you're not happy, then let's do this again, you would think Sig would say yes, but they said, nope, thanks, and they walked away. And that decision ultimately cost them hundreds of millions in 1987, but it also meant they'd make a big comeback 30 years later with zero faith in the process and the willingness to underbid everyone by $102 million just to win. But more on that towards the end of the video. Now let's fast forward to August 2005. This was when the U.S. Special Operations Command decides the 9mm M9 isn't powerful enough, and they want good old 45 ACP back in service, and this time they really want it back for the entire military. So not just for a few special units, and that was roughly 645,000 pistols across all branches. So the program was run by SOCOM, which meant the requirements were written by people who actually used pistols in combat instead of bureaucrats who'd never fired one. And eventually, the solicitation went out in November 2005, and there were 10 manufacturers had submitted their designs. The basic requirements were the following: 8-round minimum magazines with a 10-round high-capacity option. They must have military standard 1913 pick rail for accessories, threaded barrel for suppressor, and also pass a 2,000-round mean rounds between stoppages test with a 20,000-round rated service life. And lastly, the pistol had to come in 2 configurations, with and without external manual safety. So these were the designs. Starting with Beretta, they submitted a .45 caliber PX4 Storm, polymer frame, rotating barrel system that was supposed to reduce felt recoil. Beretta knew they were the incumbent and figured they had the inside track. They designed the PX4 specifically to be modular and modern, while keeping some M9 DNA in the controls. Next up was FN, the company that makes big machine guns like the M240 Bravo and M249 squad automatic weapon. So FN Herstal brought the FNP-45 USG. One thing that stood out was its 15-round capacity using a double-stack design, which is extremely rare to see a gun that can pack so many 45 rounds in a single mag. So FN has surpassed some of the JCP requirements. But when the program died, they turned it into the commercial FNX 45 Tactical that's still on the market today. And now, the next one is from Glock. Glock submitted the 21 SF. It's basically a short frame Glock 21 with a slimmed down grip to fit smaller hands. 13-round mag, striker fired, but no external safety in standard configuration. Glock was betting on the fact that most law enforcement agencies use it, and the military would go for it too, but the military didn't at all. H&K also showed up with their design, and so they showed up with the HK-45C. This one's interesting because HK worked with Larry Vickers, a former Delta Force operator, to design it, and when the JCP program died, they released it commercially. So then the HK-45 and the compact models were direct descendants of this submission. So next was Para Ordnance, and they showed up with a light double-action 1911 variant design. Para was trying to thread the needle between traditionalists who loved the 1911 platform and the military's requirement for a double-action trigger. So it was a bold move on their part, considering that 1911s have reliability issues with modern hollow points. And then there was Ruger. Ruger submitted the polymer frame P345. It's a slim profile handgun, and they tried to undercut everyone on price, thinking that will win them a contract. So Ruger's entire strategy was, we're cheap and reliable. They worked for their commercial market, but the military wasn't buying it. Now, the next one was Sig Sauer. Sig Sauer brought the full metal frame P220 Combat. Their pitch was solely based on the proven P220 platform from 1975, and military personnel already knew Sig pistols, like the Navy SEALs had been using the P226, and the M11 was already in limited service. So the P220 Combat wasn't some brand new experimental design that they had to reinvent the wheel, and they were betting on the fact that it was a battle-tested platform that only needed minor modifications to meet JCP specs. The next competitor was Smith & Wesson. They submitted the M&P 45. This striker-fired gun was competing with Glock in the law enforcement market already, but in the eyes of the military, it also didn't get any love. But there is more. Springfield Armory showed up with the XD45. This gun was technically manufactured by HS Product in Croatia, then imported to the United States by Springfield Armory. It went with a polymer frame, just like others, and it offered decent ergonomics. But Springfield was an underdog at that time, but they had a loyal following. However, it's not enough to get the military's attention either. The next one is the Taurus PT-24-7 OSS. This one was designed specifically for the SOCOM requirements, but the issue was that Taurus was trying to break into the military market with poor quality reputation, and that was immediately put on the chopping board for elimination. And it was also competing with the HK Mark 23, but it has no chance competing with HK at all. However, these guns are not exactly to replace the entire military's M9 inventories. Long story short, there were some good submissions, but no manufacturer was formally eliminated for technical failures. The program died administratively before full testing even finished. On March 10th, 2006, the Army basically hit the brakes. They renamed it Combat Pistol and slashed procurement from 645,000 pistols down to just 50,000. By autumn 2006, the whole thing was suspended indefinitely. Now, here's why this keeps happening. Iraq and Afghanistan were eating up over 20% of the entire Defense Department budget, and equipment reset costs alone were running $12 to $13 billion every year. The Heritage Foundation put out a report basically calling the handgun replacement gross mismanagement of resources, when troops desperately needed things like armored vehicles and body armor. During that time, 58% of soldiers were satisfied with their M9s. But Congress looked at the bigger picture and decided pistols weren't the priority. So basically, they threw $5 million at a study in 2007, which was basically bureaucrat language for saying, we're killing this program, but let's make it look responsible to the American public. So the JCP came to a halt, and these guns all came from JCP submissions and became commercial successes. The military didn't get new pistols, but the civilian market got some serious new toys to play with. Fast forward to later programs, though, and the 45 ACP dream was so dead, and everyone went back to 9mm again because ammunition logistics and NATO standardization matter more than stopping power and irrelevant, nostalgic debates. So that led to the modular handgun system that the military has culminated in a $580 million contract ceiling with Sig Sauer M17 and 18, while the government spent approximately $17 to $22 million running the competition. But there were many guns that competed and failed for various reasons. So let's go back in time and see what the deal was about being modular. So the Army's requirements for the MHS were ambitious. They wanted a pistol that was more effective, accurate and reliable than the M9, but with modular features that could adapt to different users and missions. The design had to accommodate various hand sizes, mount accessories via bottom pick rails, and work with fire control devices, different grips, and alternate magazines. It also needed a non-reflective neutral color for detection avoidance and had to operate with a suppressor attached. And in addition, the pistol needed a 90% or better chance of hitting a 4-inch circle at 50 meters consistently throughout its entire service life. Ergonomics had to minimize recoil and control shot dispersion. And the design needed full ambidextrous controls with specific attention to female shooters. The military didn't even specify a caliber, so instead they focused on terminal ballistics, meaning a 9mm FMJ can punch across 14 inches of ballistic gel at 50 meters. They specifically wanted pistols that could handle chamber pressures 20% higher than SAMI specifications without reliability degradation. So what exact were the reliability standards? The reliability requirements were strict: 2,000 mean rounds between stoppages, 10,000 mean rounds between failures, and a 35,000 round service life. Okay, now you have learned what the actual requirements are. So now let's go back to see what those designs were submitted. At this time, the stake was very high for Beretta for trying to maintain the contract streak, and they were desperate to win, just like others. And if they lose, that's a lot of money. And some companies can literally bankrupt if their biggest customers divorce them, aka the military. So they showcased the APX after the Army rejected their M9A3 upgrade proposal in 2015 without even requesting a sample. And the APX had zero field experience compared to everyone else. But Beretta claimed it passed every test and demonstrated 45,000 round durability with 5,000 rounds between stoppages. Meanwhile, FN showed up again, desperate to impress the military with their design. This time they showcased a variant of their FNS pistol, which later became the commercial FN 509. The problem was that their standard configuration didn't have a manual safety, which was a deal breaker. The Army explicitly required just one, and FN didn't have time to redesign another. The next one was Smith & Wesson M and P 2.0. This time they had partnered up with General Dynamics to submit basically a classic M and P with an improved trigger. They also filed an SEC disclosure in 2016 saying they were eliminated without stating why. But industry analysts have pointed to insufficient modularity, meaning the M and P offered interchangeable backstraps, providing a 1/12 inches of trigger reach adjustment. And that's not true modularity that the military was looking for. Now let's move on to CZ. For them, this was a rare participation, but they didn't go far at all. So they expressed interest in submitting the P7 and P9, but chose not to formally enter. The next one was Chris. Chris is the company that came up with the famous Chris Vector, and they had submitted the Sphinx SDP. It's a Swiss-designed pistol with excellent build quality. However, its limited U.S. market presence, and simply the U.S. Army didn't even bother giving it a chance. Datonix Defense entered the STX, which actually featured genuine metal chassis modularity. Then they withdrew without any explanation. Some analysts speculated they were dealing with insufficient production capacity or some financial constraints. Now here comes Ruger again, and they have never truly won the military's love in the past at all. They thought to try again, but they were 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So they designed the Ruger American pistol specifically for MHS, but then somehow declined to submit. They apparently decided competing wasn't worth the cost. Now the last one was the only one that came so close to winning, and that was Glock. So Glock submitted both 9mm and 40 cal variants. Those were G17 and G19, G22 and G23 and 40. Glock added bilateral thumb safeties to meet requirements, which was controversial in the Glock community because Glocks never had manual safeties. Their pitch was still hanging on the fact that law enforcement adoption should give them an edge, which actually landed them into the final with Sig Sauer. When it comes down to money, Sig Sauer puts down a $169,500,000 bid. Glock put down their best bid, roughly $272,200,000. That's a $102.7 million difference, a 38% premium. So then the General Account Office came back and basically said there is no reasonable support for the conclusion that Glock's chances at award would have been substantially increased if its price had been $101 million more than Sig Sauer's bid, instead of $102.7 million more. And so the expensive bid put Glock on the chopping board again, but it's not over just yet. But technical factors mattered too. Glock's modularity consisted of interchangeable backstraps and a snap-on beaver tail. The Army was like, so the Glock 19 was not 100% modular because Sig's serialized fire control unit was swappable between different frame sizes and calibers, and that's real modularity. In addition, Sig's ammunition proposal earned an outstanding rating versus Glock's marginal rating, and that partnership with Winchester also differentiated the bids. So what is Glock going to do? And they were so close to getting the deal. The problem still hinged on one thing, and that has to do with the manual safety controversy. It just means Glock's reluctance to adapt. Later, Glock submitted a multi-page argument that manual safeties were outdated and not required. The Army came back and said, the modular handgun system shall have a manual safety and stop bending the rules. So just make what we asked for and stop reinventing the wheel to be clever, and the Army isn't dumb. So then Glock said, okay, if you want bilateral thumb safeties, here it is. Here's our Glock 19 with a damn safety that you want. And are you happy now? So now the Glock 19 has it. Glock also offered a single design with variable back straps. Sig submitted the full-size M17 and a compact M18 that can share a common fire control unit. Basically 2 guns, 1 system. However, based on the GAO protest decision, Sig Sauer's full-sized handgun had a higher stoppage rate than Glock's handgun, and there may have been other problems with the weapon's accuracy. And the statement buried in footnote 13 right here represents the only official acknowledgement that Sig exhibited testing weaknesses relative to a competitor. Yet the Army awarded Sig the contract anyway, primarily because Glock's bid was $102.7 million higher. The compact handgun XM18 results were entirely redacted from GAO documents. Basically, testing stopped at 12,500 rounds per system when the service life specification called for 25,000 rounds. It's literally a point Glock highlighted in its protest as evidence of incomplete testing. However, the General Accounting Office dismissed this argument completely. During initial operational test and evaluation at Fort Bragg, 120 stoppages occurred with the XM17 and 85 with the XM18 over approximately 165,000 rounds fired by 132 military personnel. Half of XM17 stoppages and 75% of XM18 stoppages were failure of slide-to-lock rear malfunctions, and 60% of which occurred among just 8 shooters using high pistol grips. Double ejections have increased in frequency as round counts climbed. So how far did this drag on to replace the M9 while money is on the line? So Glock filed a GAO protest on February 24th, 2017. In it, it had 4 major allegations. The first was that the RFP required at least 2 awards after Phase 1. Second, the Army improperly waived compact gun reliability evaluation for Sig, and that was unfair. Third, the pricing was miscalculated by $1.6 million in spare parts. And lastly, technical evaluation contained some errors. So what did the government finally say about this? The GAO denied the protest on June 5th, 2017, saying that up to 3 base awards language was permissive, not mandatory. While acknowledging the Army miscalculated $1.6 million in spare parts pricing, the GAO ruled this wasn't prejudicial given the $102 million gap. While that was going on, Steyr Arms filed a patent lawsuit on May 3rd, 2017, alleging Sig's P250 and P320 infringe their pistol, whose housing is composed of plastic, patent. But long story short, Sig won summary judgment on February 25th, 2020. No infringement due to structural differences. So that was the extremely turbulent 32-year journey to replace the M9. If you like this content and think you can come up with a way better design, then please comment what will that be below.